On February 23, 1999, 39-year-old star Gail Boomer was visiting Uncle Mike's bar, now called Nobody's Business, in Kansas City, Kansas, with her roommate Carolyn Marshall. Carolyn stated while they were in the bar, a male stranger walked up to Gail and for no apparent reason threw her off the bar stool. She then got up and insisted she was alright, and her attacker was forced to leave. Carolyn would leave the bar after finishing her drink and asked the bartender to keep an eye on Gail, whom she planned to pick up later. When Carolyn returned to the bar, she was told that Gail had already left with 2 men. 5 days later, with no word from Gail, Carolyn reported her missing. Witnesses at the bar told authorities that she was involved in an altercation with another patron during the evening. The individual is believed to be a career criminal with a history of violent behavior, particularly towards women. He allegedly knocked her to the ground and beat her, causing her to lose consciousness. According to the witnesses, Gail had not left the bar with 2 men like her roommate was told. In fact, she was dragged out of the bar by the 2 men. She has never been heard from again, and authorities believe she may have met foul play inside the bar and her body hidden in another location. In October 1999, William Eugene Gino Spradlin and Robert Franklin Butch Horn were charged with second-degree murder in Gail's case. Both suspects have extensive criminal histories and have served time in prison. The charges were later dismissed because over a dozen witnesses to the alleged crime refused to testify against the defendants because they were terrified to cooperate. Authorities believe that several people have information related to the case, but the individuals have not come forward. One of the bar patrons who was a witness in Gail's case was Sean Pernice. Sean's wife, Renee, disappeared in 2009, and he was later convicted of her murder, although his wife's body has never been located. However, he isn't considered a suspect in Gail's case and was only questioned because he was a witness to Gail being assaulted the first time. He said in an interview from prison that he was a medic at the time and bandaged her arm. He then goes on to say that the 2 suspects returned to the bar later that night without Gail and covered in dust, which they assumed was from a local rock quarry. Investigators reopened the case in 2017 and began to do more searching for her body. They ripped up tiles and baseboards at the bar looking for bloodstains. They are trying to locate a possible witness named Edward, who may have worked as a mechanic. Authorities don't believe he was directly involved in the suspected murder, but they think he has information on it. He used to frequent the Turner section of Kansas City, Kansas, and possibly lived or worked in the area, but has since moved out of state. Over the years, detectives have searched caves and tunnels looking for Gail, but have found nothing. In 2019, police got a tip that she was buried beneath the concrete of a house where her boyfriend lived at the time. A cadaver dog indicated it smelled something, and radar showed something below the foundation, but her body was never found. Also in 2019, the empty lot near the bar where Gail lived at the time in the 1700 block of South 49th Street was searched and dug up over several days, but again nothing. Gail's sister, Cynthia Hurdy, became a private detective and trained with search and rescue dogs. She has personally confronted the suspects and searched for her sister's body. Her family hopes that the witnesses will reconsider and agree to testify one day. She also states that the police were unable to search a truck owned by one of the suspects. Another vehicle owned by the bartending girlfriend of one of the suspects was found burned either to destroy evidence or to intimidate her. Gail left behind a 3-year-old son who was raised by his grandparents after her disappearance. As of today, this case remains unsolved. "13-year-old Beverly Ann Ward was born and raised in Junction City, Kansas. On July 4, 1978, at her home on 227 West 11th Street, she and a neighboring 9-year-old girl, who was in town visiting a relative across the street, had come over to have a sleepover. There were 2 beds in Beverly's room, and she was sleeping in one, and the 9-year-old girl was in the other. In the early morning hours, Beverly's family were awoken by a commotion outside. Someone had thrown a brick through an apartment window, and everyone had gotten up to see what was going on. At this time, the family assumed Beverly had woken up as well and was watching the commotion with them. Once the disturbance was over, they realized Beverly was not with them and was missing from the home. Her mother, Bernice Ward, would report her missing at 5:30 a.m. Beverly was scheduled to go to summer camp that day and had her bags packed along with $12 she had saved for the trip. Upon investigating her room, they found none of her clothes were missing and the $12 was still there. They also found the window screen directly above her bed was cut and removed. At this point, investigators believed that someone came in her room between 3 and 5 a.m. and took Beverly. Also, it was a hot night and investigators believe the window may have already been open and the person who took Beverly only had to deal with the window screen. The 9-year-old girl who had been sleeping in the same room said she never heard or saw anything. The police spoke with neighbors and friends at the time to find some leads but were unsuccessful. Information was entered into the National Crime Information Center computer system and they notified the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. In 1978, Junction City had a reputation as a transient area where people used it as a community to pass through or to temporarily reside in. There were a few suspects questioned in connection to Beverly's disappearance, 2 of whom were seen in a vehicle by neighbors, but the sighting wasn't around the time Beverly went missing. A third person who was in the area was also named as a person of interest, but no evidence could tie them to the case. Also, none of her family members are considered suspects in her case. Beverly has never been found, and as of today, this case remains unsolved. Rachel Geraldine Pratt was born May 8, 1979. She had 7 siblings and grew up in Garden City, Kansas. At the age of 14, she began sneaking around with an 18-year-old boy. When she was 15 years old, she was caught shoplifting a pregnancy test from Walmart. Her mother became very upset, demanding to know who she could be pregnant by, not knowing that she had been seeing the 18-year-old. Rachel eventually admitted to having an older boyfriend and gave her mother his name. Her mother, Jan, went to the boy's home and spoke to his father. Then, the boy's mother called Jan and told her that her son was not involved with Rachel. In the meantime, she took Rachel to the health department to verify her pregnancy. After this, she took Rachel to the police department to file a report because of their age difference. A few weeks later, the boy went to the police department and confirmed that he was indeed Rachel's boyfriend. He was then charged with aggravated indecent liberties with a child on December 31, 1994. 2 weeks later, Rachel would go missing. She was last seen watching a movie at home with her brother around 1 a.m. on January 16, 1995. Jan came home from work at 2 a.m. and realized Rachel and her coat were gone and her son had fallen asleep during the movie. She stayed up all night waiting for Rachel to come home and claimed that at 5 a.m. she heard a car driving near her house and recognized it as Rachel's boyfriend's. Although her family reported Rachel missing to the police, they didn't actively start investigating until 5 days after she disappeared. Around the time the police started their investigation, a group of girls claimed that they had seen Rachel talking on a payphone and her boyfriend was with her. They claimed that after they finished the phone call, they left the phone booth and then asked the girls for a ride. The couple then went into Dillon's grocery store. This witness sighting is uncorroborated, and the boyfriend denies this incident even took place. The boyfriend claims that he had not had any contact with Rachel after her disappearance and that he had no part in it either. Rachel was scheduled to be a witness against her boyfriend, who was being prosecuted for unlawful sexual relations with her. Because Rachel disappeared before she could testify, the charges were dropped. Rachel's father now lives in Illinois, but her mother has stayed in the same house and keeps the same phone number in the hopes that Rachel might someday return. There is no evidence to indicate that Rachel has given birth. There's also no record of her ever receiving a driver's license, a copy of her birth certificate, or a social security card. There have been no sightings of her in many years, but authorities remain hopeful that she is still alive. To this day, the boyfriend has not been ruled out as a suspect, but the police say there isn't much to indicate foul play, and as of today, this case remains unsolved. Vincent Moore was born March 3, 2015, to Michelle Mendez and Gary Moore. On June 5, 2015, Michelle dropped off 3-month-old Vincent and his 2-year-old brother at their father Gary's home for visitation. Gary took both children to Texas sometime in mid to late June, and they stayed there until July 9th before he returned to Wichita, Kansas. During this time, Michelle made repeated attempts to get in touch with Gary and see the children, but she was unable to reach them, so at the end of the month, she notified police. Vincent was last seen with Gary in the early morning hours of July 11th, 2015, leaving his house near South Hydraulic Avenue and Tulsa Street in Wichita, Kansas. Gary was carrying a blue and black floral print diaper bag. Gary was arrested at a traffic stop in Wichita on July 29, 18 days after Vincent was last seen. He was arrested and jailed on unrelated warrants for probation violations and failure to appear in court. When he was arrested, he had Vincent's 2-year-old brother with him, but not Vincent. Gary claimed he gave Vincent back to Michelle when he returned from Texas, but she says that is not true and she doesn't know where her son is. Michelle would pass a polygraph test backing up her story. Soon after his disappearance, police searched along railroad tracks in a wooded area near the Wichita suburb of Derby, Kansas, but turned up empty-handed. In 2014, before Vincent was born, Gary was sentenced to probation for misdemeanor battery on Michelle. He was ordered to pay court costs, report to a probation officer, wear a GPS tracking device on his ankle, and have no contact with Michelle. Despite all this, Michelle and him would marry in February 2015. After Vincent went missing, Gary was sentenced to a year in jail for violating his probation by failing to pay his court cost. Also, before he traveled to Texas, he had cut off the GPS tracking device on his ankle, which led to an additional charge. In May 2016, he would plead guilty to this charge for tampering with electronic monitoring equipment and was sentenced to additional time in prison. According to court documents, Michelle was concerned for the safety of their children when they were in Gary's care. She filed for a protective order on June 18th, 2 weeks after she last saw the boys. In her application, she wrote that Gary had never intentionally hurt Vincent and his brother, but stated Gary was rougher than he intends to be and that he tried to use the children to control her. She said she thought it was only a matter of time before he hurt them. In August 2015, Kansas Department of Child Protective Services removed Vincent's brother from Michelle's custody and placed him in foster care. At a hearing held in October, DCF officials said there was clear and convincing evidence that Vincent is deceased. Vincent has since been declared legally dead. However, Gary's family has stated they believe Vincent is still alive. Gary states that he believes Michelle stashed him somewhere and he hopes that he is still alive. As of today, no one has been arrested in connection with baby Vincent's disappearance, and his case remains unsolved. Megan Renee Foglesong was born January 20th, 1994. Her parents divorced when she was about 6 years old. At 9 years old, she moved to Oneida, Illinois, to live with her father and stepmother. Years later, she moved back to Alden, Kansas, to live with her mother, Pam. Pam is described as having a wild lifestyle and having a somewhat competitive friendship with her daughter. At some point, her mother would unfortunately introduce her to David Madden. David was her mom's ex-lover, and he was 14 years older than Megan. David was a former Marine, but was described as paranoid and violent with hatred towards law enforcement and the government. She began having a tumultuous relationship with David, and the couple were on and off again. David was very physically and mentally abusive and once placed her in a straitjacket at gunpoint and threatened to end her life. Frustrated with the abuse, she briefly moved back to Illinois to be with her dad and stepmom. but she would unfortunately again return to Alden and reconnect with David. In December 2014, David and Megan were at her friend Kelly Starnes' home when Kelly made a frantic 911 call.
Spartan County 911, what's the address for your emergency?
David Madden took his girlfriend against her will from my house and we're headed to Alden.
Kelly Starnes describing the terrifying moment.
Next thing I know, she's screaming for help, and they're doing 100 miles down the road, and he's got a hold of her through the window, and she's outside the pickup.
Calling 911, his friend Megan Foglesong violently taken from his home.
But he threatened to put her in a straitjacket and throw her in the closet. He threatened to kill her, and he's had a gun pointed at her before.
Even after this, they would make up and continue dating. On November 30th, 2015, Megan would register her last activity on Facebook when she replied to a message from a friend and said she was at David's house. The next day, David would text his neighbor, who was also the local sheriff, and say he caught Megan stealing from him, which led to an argument, and she left. On December 7th, Megan's phone sent a text to a friend saying, "I'm fine." However, her friend is not sure whether she sent the message herself or not. Due to her lifestyle, 21-year-old Megan was not reported missing until February 10th, 2016, over 2 months after she was last seen. She was spontaneous, but had never gone for an extended time without contacting her loved ones. She had a prepaid phone, and the carrier doesn't keep records for it after 10 days, so authorities were unable to use phone records to help with their investigation. Megan told 2 friends that if she ever disappeared, David would probably be the one responsible. In February 2017, David, who was wanted for questioning in the disappearance of Megan, would lead police on a high-speed chase through Rice County and Barton County, Kansas, and was arrested later that day. He was charged with aggravated assault in that case and sentenced to probation. Searches of his property turned up 2 crates containing 24 metal pipe bombs, 2 live military ordnance projectiles, 12 containers of smokeless powder, a railroad torpedo, a .45 caliber pistol, and an AK-47 machine gun. He said he'd found the machine gun in Iraq while serving there with the Marines and brought it back to the U.S. In April 2019, he was indicted on 1 count of illegal possession of a machine gun and became wanted on a federal warrant. Later that month, he and his girlfriend Erin and her 7-year-old son were pulled over by an officer. Erin was driving and her young son was in the back seat. David then shot the undersheriff 5 times out the window. After the shooting, Erin claims David forced her to drive at gunpoint. She drove to his home, where he then loaded a laundry basket with guns and ammunition. Then she drove him to his father Tom Madden's home in Raymond, Kansas, where David fatally shot him. When police arrived at the scene that evening, David shot the sheriff and exchanged gunfire with other officers, and then after a 6-hour standoff, David fatally shot himself. His girlfriend Erin was then arrested for obstructing apprehension of David and aggravated endangering of a child because she knew he was a felon that carried a gun. A mutual friend of David and Megan's reported that after her disappearance, David said to them, "No one else will have to worry about her again." There is an overwhelming amount of information in this case, which could be speculation, rumors, or just hard to prove, so I won't be covering it all. What we do know is Megan has never been found, but foul play is suspected, and sadly, as of today, this case remains unsolved.